Hey, listeners and viewers, just before we kick off today, want to let you know about something exciting that Troy and I did recently. We were on a panel with Sarah Steele from Let's Talk About Sex for the upcoming event that the Religious Trauma Collective's hosting. This is the first ever online event which they've hosted. It'll be 19th to the 21st of June, 2025. You're going to hear about storytellers, therapists, researchers, cult experts, people still inside the faith, and trying to make safer spaces for people, but also a place for connection. This is going to be a great get together of people who are going to really, I guess, further the conversation that we do on this podcast all the time. So head across to the religiostraumacollective.com for all the details, and you can register for the event that is, again, 19th to the 21st of June, 2025. Hope to see you there.
Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist. Here we are again in video as well as audio, so you can choose the platform of your choice. Brian, welcome back.
Yes, thank you. See, I'm merched up today. I've got the T-shirt on for the pod. I woke up, bit of a cold morning, and thought I need a long sleeve T-shirt, and this one was on top of the pile, pretty much. And I thought, why not wear it today? How you been?
Yeah, very good. Yeah, I've been good. I was just going to say it's been a long time since we were top of the pile, but let's get there again. Let's get there again. So we've got Ryan James, who is a father of two. He's living in Melbourne. He's a creative and a business development consultant. And he is the brother of today's topic, Jonas James. So we're going to talk with Ryan all about Jonas. We've got I think it's a fascinating story to tell, and I'm really looking forward to it. But Ryan James, welcome to I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for inviting me.
Good to have you. Hey, Ryan, we ask this question of everyone when they come onto our show. Were you a teenage fundamentalist?
Definitely not. No. Hell no. Can I? Hell no. Is that all right?
Yeah. You can say fuck no if you want.
You can say fuck no. Great.
Yeah.
No, I wasn't.
Well, incidentally, hell is the place you'll go because you weren't. So,
That's right.
Ryan,
That's right.
be
I
prepared.
did attend a lot of Sunday school because my friend was part of the Salvation Army. It was
so
more
you're
for the
familiar with timbrels, tambourines, all of those sort of things,
Loved it.
obviously.
It was the music. It was the red and yellow and blue ribbons that actually got my attention on those tambourines.
Ryan, we are going to talk with you today about your brother, Jonas James. And Jonas has a fascinating story. And my story intersects with Jonas, but we'll get to that a little bit later. But people are going to be wondering, why do you want to talk about Jonas James? And I think you summed it up really well when I heard you say something recently. You said, Jonas was a rock star. He may have never been famous, but he was a rock star. You still feel that's the truth?
Yeah, definitely. Certainly a character lives his life to the fullest and really, it's just interesting person. So I think there's a lot going on, a lot of complexity, and, some people are unique and different. Yeah.
And it's interesting. Jonas is someone who I don't actually recall meeting. However, I have heard so much about Jonas because Troy so close to Jonas, like always talking about Jonas and I did this, Jonas and I did that. I just remember this was wild time with Jonas. So I'm looking forward to some of these stories that you talk about and some of the reflections of those times, because Jonas also, when I first started coming to Great Big OOG back in the day, I don't know whether it was a matter of weeks or months that I missed the intersection with Jonas, or Jonas may have still been there and I just didn't connect with Jonas while I was there. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more and hearing some of the perspective from you, Ryan, because you'll definitely bring those different layers than Troy.
Yeah, and for people to know, this episode really is about the intersection of religion and cults, music, drugs, mental health, fame, superstardom. I mean, it's all tied in. But Ryan, let's start back at the beginning. Let's set some scenes about who was Jonas, where did Jonas come from, what's his history, his backstory.
Sure. So I'm Jonas's younger brother. He's older than me by 5 years. We've got another brother who's another 3 years older than that, Jordan, and those two are they share a mother, a different parent to me, and there's a whole bunch of other brothers and sisters going on. We were children of the 70s, um, blended families, divorces, remarriages, things like that. It started for Jonas being born in America. He's the only one that was born overseas of all of the siblings. Um, and I'm not sure if you and he connected on both of your experiences as kids living in America. I'm sure you did. And then my dad, I think with the pressure of Jonas's mum, went AWOL from the American Army and left and came back to Australia. Another side story is, 40 years later, my dad was arrested as a deserter in America. That's a whole nother story. And Jonas always has identified as being American. And I think that early sort of movement, it really sparked this issues of identity and being able to, this you talk about him being a rock star. That's something he invented for himself. And I think that this sort of being born in another country at a very young age was very aware of these things being part of himself and using them as a way to change himself. So he's a very changeable person, even from he probably was 2 or 3. I don't know his exact age when he moved over, but um, that Americanism was a very big part of him. But then when they came over here, it was a tumultuous relationship, and it broke down. And from then on, for maybe the next 5 or 6 years, there was a whole bunch of us kids that would get together on the weekends. Typical, kids coming together to spend one weekend here with this parent or that parent, but with a whole bunch of parents. We would often convene at my dad's place with 7 of us all together, and we would have Jordan and Jonas in particular, just dominate that situation. It was, Lord of the Flies, really strong personalities, and my dad's got a very strong personality that we all tried to emulate, especially in that sort of context where we would, you know, be played off each other as a sort of game, from young irresponsible parents. Now that I'm an old parent, I know the sort of traps you try not to fall into when you raise your kids. But my dad had Jordan when he was 17, I think. So they're just like, yeah, let's fight him in the backyard, let's race him. That's the sort of environment. But it was a very I say that. And that to me now, if I said that and my parent teacher now, would be horrified. But it was much worse than that. It was much worse than that. Dad came from, he's the eldest of 13. They were all in homes, many of which were religious institutions where there was sexual and physical abuse, severe. Many of them were institutionalized. Dad's brother, Danny in particular, spent most of his life in Pentridge prison through many different iterations, and we spent a lot of time with him. And just leaping forward to Jonas in adulthood, we've often had conversations about him saying he's like Uncle Danny. Now, Uncle Danny is, has been, diagnosed criminally insane. So for him to make those own parallels within himself, just tells you the sort of environment that we're talking about as children. None of us really experienced that direct violence as kids, or though we certainly saw that. Bullying is really underselling it, but just that sort of activity deployed as a mechanism of manipulation and control and social. I'm not even sure how to describe it, but I think I'm making my point though. It was to be involved in that level of seriousness as a kid. We're all to this day still, I think, are dealing with the repercussions of that trauma. We never really recognized that trauma because Dad being the eldest of 13, seeing all that happen to all his siblings, and then as it goes through, it sort of gets filtered or washed out. Like, well, I can't really complain because my older brother had it worse, and then they had an older brother, and suddenly you've got 7 of us. There's 20 people ahead of me who had a worse experience. So that's the sort of thing that we grew up with as kids, and as adults, we're sort of like, oh no, we were all fine. But now, as adults, we're starting to talk about some of these things that we experienced, and
So generational trauma. Tick.
generational trauma.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So tell us more about the dynamic with you and your brothers and where Jonas fit in that, because he was the middle child, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, I mean, with the age difference, I mean, where do these youngest, middle, and older things kick in, right? But him being 5 years older and essentially living in a different household, he would probably see himself as the younger of two in some ways. So he's got a bit of that younger sort of lack of responsibility part of him. But also then when all the rest of us are together, he was certainly that middle child where he has that overage. I mean, I'm no psychologist. I just, you just try to promote yourself in these different hierarchies that we invent. But yeah, it was a very interesting dynamic because there was it was a mix of what we were given in terms of that environment. When you come together on the weekends, there's certain things like which movie you choose to go to, or which, who's going to, get the biggest piece of the cake, or, there's these things as kids that all kids and all families go through. But there was certainly an extra level because of the different family dynamics. It was also, I wouldn't say it was jealousy or anything like that, but there was certainly like, different levels of attention seeking for our parents' attention and all those things that, 8-year-olds and 12-year-olds and 5-year-olds do to try and make their mark in the world and build their own niche. In fact, I mean, I'm digressing here. I was just listening the other day to a podcast, and they were really saying that it was an academic about this stuff, about how I think of the Fortune 500 now, most of them are actually, it's changed. It used to be middle child and eldest. Now it's a lot of the youngest children, because nowadays that it's about niche finding. So if you're the eldest, you just pick whatever you want. I can be the nerd, I can be the jock, I can be whatever. But as you go down the sibling list, you need to be much more specific about the niche that you fill, and it actually helps you build a bit more problem solving skills to find specific things. Yes, that's all good and well, and I can identify with that. But Jonas had that early. He didn't need the pecking order to have these problem-solving skills. It's almost like he was born with these innate skills to look at what was going on and read a room at a very young age. So he could
And
go
you guys were raised in the country, is that right? In the countryside? Or Jonas lived there for a while? Where did that all fit?
Sure. So we were raised in the city. So he was in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. I was in the southeastern suburbs. And then when he was sort of primary school age, maybe end of primary school, he moved to Broadford, which is in the sort of an hour and a half, maybe north of Melbourne, sort of past Hume. And he went to Broadford High School. And that is very much, I wouldn't say the bush, because it's sort of not many trees out there really, but it's certainly the country. Do you know, are you familiar with that area?
Yeah, for sure. North.
Yeah. And
Broadford was that was its infamy was the Hells Angels had their headquarters out there in Melbourne.
Yeah. And interestingly, when I started high school and I started smoking pot, and I was at a guy's house who was a drug dealer. I mean, he's a drug dealer, sold weed. And I said, oh yeah, he's telling you some Broadford. I go, oh, my brother's from Broadford. I was like 12, 13. This kid would have been 16. And he goes, what's his name? I said, Jones. And he goes, oh, did he used to wear cowboy boots to school? And I go, yeah. And a belt buckle, yeah. And like even through that, he knew my brother. So talk about rock star, like just some bogan drug dealer in Frankston who was at Broadford for a year, straight away knew the recall from that name, from a 12-year-old kid, like just buying a bag of $10 weed from him. Like
I have to say, like I'm listening to this, and there's things that I'm learning here for the first time, but just the similarities. It's like a Star Trek episode where it's like an alternate universe, because my parents stayed together, but there was still three boys. There was this playing against one another, all this kind of stuff. It's just like an alternate storyline for myself, which is something that we'll talk about a little bit later, which is where Jonas and I connected. And I spent time in the US, as you know, where we did actually wear belt buckles and cowboy boots to school, but everybody did it, right? Because Jonas was American. So there you go. Tell me about the music. Because music was a big part of Jonas's life. What did that look like when he was young?
Yeah, sure. So our grandfather was a jazz musician, self-taught, played lots of instruments, banjo, trumpet, trad jazz. And to this day, my dad still goes and sees trad jazz bands. I can't think of anything. I can't think of worse, but it's not like my favorite style of music. But it was always a lot of taught to us that it was in our blood, it was in our bones, this musical thing. And and we all identify with it. The generation below my grandfather, so my parents and all his siblings, none of them were really musical, but the next generation, we all really identified with music and the sort of expressive quality of it. Jonas identified with that, but he also identified with the sort of fame and social elements and the sort of the idolization and being the figment of 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 the audience projecting onto this person. He wanted to be that person as much as he loved the mechanics of the music and the expression. And he and I used to talk at length about this sort of science versus art and heart versus head and these sorts of things. And he, whilst we talked about those things. In my view, he was much more into this sort of the function of music and what it could deliver, which was interesting. But we used to sit around and we would just, talk about, Led Zeppelin, and we'd talk about the Beatles and all those typical things. But then we would, the '90s came along and we would become obsessed at following all those things down the rabbit hole. Like Nirvana came from this and came from that and came from this, and trying to follow the musicology of it. And we both went our separate ways as teens and ended up both studying music. So when we came back together later in life, in my early 20s, early 20s, we really connected on that, and we'd done a lot of homework. We'd started off as teens just talking about Led Zeppelin and the Beatles and things, but then we went away and we'd become experts in music, in both playing instruments and talking about music and using music as a metaphor for life. But he'd really honed his craft much more than I did. He practiced very hard and became a very good guitarist. And he's known sort of around the place as being this sort of Led Zeppelin-esque, like, sort of guitarist. But his classical guitar work was really, I've never known anyone. I've seen concerts of international performers, but I've never seen anyone be that good at classical guitar in the flesh, even to this day. And I see a lot of music. And so he would practice 5 or 6 hours a day to get that happening. He was very dedicated. But on reflection, I think a lot of that work was around, again, in service of becoming a rock star. It wasn't because he wanted to express himself. And this is all just conjecture from a brother's point of view, and maybe, I'm tapping into some of my, wanting the biggest piece of cake stuff here. I don't know. I don't know these biases, but it's not like I didn't think it at the time. And this is in a retrospective view. At the time, I'm like, yeah, this is awesome. But I sort of saw myself as being sort of much more, tapping into the true essence of the art and the value of music, because I was doing it for the sake of expression. And, that was, and we used to argue, violently, but in a fun way, if that's a thing, about the merits of that. And I'm like, oh, well, you're just doing it to get girls. And he's like, yeah, you wish you could get the same girls that I could get. And I'm like, yeah, well, the girls I'm going to get are going to love me for my art, not just because I wear the belt buckle, right? And like this. And we would argue like that over coffee for hours and hours. And it was some of the most fun things I had. And yeah.
So Ryan, I don't want to get ahead, but it's actually a good segue, because Jonas was a Pentecostal. And if there's one thing that Pentecostalism attracts, it's narcissism and a desire for fame. And I can testify to that again, being, Jonas's parallel universe doppelganger. But what about the religion growing up?
Okay.
You
Yes.
guys religious?
No, and in fact, I wouldn't say anti-religious, because that sort of might imply that we took some action to argue strongly against it. But it was more that we were all very aware of the abuse that had happened at the hands of religion to our parents' generation. So we were against the institution, Catholicism, and the use of religion to tap into a source of victims, right? So that's a theme in our life, but but I've covered that in some sense. But if we talk about spirituality, that was also absent. That was more absent, if you like. So we were aware of the church and religion and the role that it could play in that negative sense, but none of us were really spiritual, or not even in terms of like the cosmos or zodiacs or anything like that. It was really encouraged in us to be like very pragmatic, business-like, mathematical decision making. But Jonas had other views. He was more about, for this sort of guy that I described before as sort of the science more than the heart guy, he would really tap into the way things felt and the way that the world played a role in that, and the universe played a role in that. He was much more plugged into the connective things that we don't see and that are within us that we can tap into, and that blew the minds of the other generation, my dad's generation. They're like, "Who is this guy talking about this stuff?" Like, and last time I saw you, Troy, I sort of mentioned this as well. Jonas had this great capacity, and I'm sure this sort of, it's a chicken and egg thing about, I was there before he was sort of Pentecostal, this great capacity to talk about these things in a way that was very deep and very technical in a way, but could really plug into the sort of common man, let's call it common person, where he could be speaking to, you know, that drug dealer from Broadford High, and he wasn't shying away from those matters. He wasn't like just talking about, oh, this is good weed, man, and check out my boots. He could also talk to that guy and speak about how you feel about this and connecting, and somehow draw out that guy's spirituality, even if it is a conversation about Led Zeppelin or weed. And at 12 he could do that. He could, and like, yeah, it's
Sure.
amazing.
And did he have some sort of brush with early Christianity? Because
So
my understanding was that he did, and I didn't realize this until much later on. A friend of mine, a mutual friend of ours, said to me that Jonas had actually gone along to some sort of Pentecostal church up in Broadford, or as a teen, or yeah. Do you know anything about that?
now I don't know the exact story, but I know that when he moved to Broadford, he went to school there for a few years, and then I think there was contact with a family that was involved with the Pentecostal church, and he went to the selective school, Melbourne High. He auditioned, I was going to say, sat the test and got in. And I think
Which
part of that,
speaks to intelligence too, because that's the cream of the crop. That's a government selective school for boys, and you got to do an exam, and so the fact that he got in there speaks to intelligence.
very much so, very much so. And I think part of moving down, so that was when he was living in Broadford. And we had no family living near Melbourne High, and I'm led to believe that he moved in with a friend whose family was associated with the church. So that sort of transition from the country to the city was facilitated through the support of a religious householder, and that sort of framework that a lot of that stuff, that you guys know much more than I do, brings. It's sort of like, oh yeah, come down, we'll support you, and we know that your family aren't coming with you, but we can be like a quasi family. There was a bit of that happening in that transition in his life, and he was only sort of 14, 15 when that happened, and he never really moved back home. Like, that was his exit out of the household as an adult. And I think that, I mean, I'm 47 now, and I think most people my age were sort of at the end. Most of us didn't leave home at 14. I left when I was sort of 17, 18. That's sort of normal. Now it's like, it got out to, I'm a demographer by trade. It went out to about 30. Now it's come down to sort of 25. But, you have to sort of be a baby boomer almost to leave when you're 12 or 13. And he was almost in that category. You're right. But a lot of that, I don't think that would have happened if it wasn't for this one particular family that I heard of that helped him with that.
Okay, so he'd had some sort of brush with the church at that stage. Another thing I want to talk about before we get to his young adult stage, actually, look, we'll hold on to it because I love your analogy about Elvis, but we'll come back to it. But the Jonas and drugs.
Yes.
How young was he? How old was he when he started taking and messing around with drugs? Because I know he's taking acid in his teenage years.
That's right. So that transition period when he's moved down to, where he's sort of still at Broadford and coming down to Melbourne and going to Melbourne High, that's, what is that, year 9 or 10 of school, year 9 or 10? What are you, 13, 14, 15? He was definitely well and truly taking acid at that point in his life. And I understand that, I mean, even at 12 and 11, when I would go and hang out with him at that age, he introduced me to pot at that age. And so, and to be honest, it wasn't like it was in service of accessing a spirituality, another level of consciousness, another sort of to tap into another part of self that was only accessible through these means. That was the story that he gave to me, why I should smoke these cones. I remember, I know the night vividly. I can still, that's the only night I've sort of really hallucinated, and who knows, it's the memory of a 12-year-old. And to be honest, I still hold it against him. I still wish I'd never spoken those cones. In fact, I was addicted to pot for the next 10 years after that. It took me a lot of effort to stop doing that.
Well, Jonas was a giver, if nothing else, right?
That's right. So, but I truly believe he wasn't doing it to corrupt me, that he really, tapped into a certain thing in himself and he wanted to share that. And he also wanted to tap into it in others. And that was his way of, I mean, don't get me wrong, there was also a sense of like, being the rock star again and control by being the person to deliver these things. And sort of, so he's found a tool that can service all of these things, which in this particular case was drugs. But acid was a big thing, and acid in his life. And I know that you and he probably shared more drug experience than I ever did with him. I don't know if that's an early reveal of what we're about to talk about.
No, that's where I want to go next for sure. And that is in about 1989, 1990, somewhere around there. I was in between. For those that listen to the pod will know my story. I had left one extreme religious cult. I was in an interim stage before joining a less extreme, but also religious cult. And in that interim period, I got mixed up with a bad scene, started doing a lot of drugs, and eventually ended up on acid. And it was funny, the night that I was actually offered it, I thought, if I take this, it's going to ruin my life. But, now I know, hashtag ADHD, didn't matter, popped it, off I went. And I got involved very much in the beginnings of Melbourne's rave scene. So the emergence of Melbourne's rave scene, it was well and truly in swing. We all looked to England and that sort of acid house kind of stage. And one night after Club Chevron, I met Jonas through a mutual friend of ours named Michelle, and we were in a park. So I was after clubbing, and we were still all still tripping and sort of coming down, and in that sort of, yucky sort of stage where you want to smoke a joint, etc. And Jonas, remember, this is rave, and we go to this park, and Jonas is there with a guitar. Right? And it's like, who has a guitar when you're raving? And there he was, but he was connecting our acid trips that we were in the middle of back to 60s and 70s rock. And I loved it because I had grown up with, Jimi Hendrix and Deep Purple and all this kind of stuff, and definitely, and Led Zeppelin as well. And he was playing, as I remember it, maybe it wasn't this way, but I'm pretty sure it was. He was playing I Am the Walrus, right? And we're all like, just come out of, and he's sitting there, I am he and you are he, which is exactly what you're describing. And that was it. It was like, wow, this dude is really rock and roll, yet he was just, cast off to, to go with the drugs as any of the rest of us. And so he became part of our gang, our little tripper gang, but not the inner circle, right? He was always sort of on the edge, but he was very much connected to Michelle, and Michelle had been a friend of mine. I just want to share a couple of stories, right? Because this is going to sort of feed that. I can remember Jonas and I, and a few others as well. We took some acid one night, and we went into IDs, which is a club in Paran. And I remember that night, I was like, not convinced, but I was going with it. It was fun that I was on the inside of a moon base at a nightclub on the inside of a moon base. And I knew I wasn't really on the moon, but I'd go up to people and go, hey, man, I'm on the moon. And then I'd look at them and go, I know I'm not really on the moon, but I'm on the moon. And I was at this dance party. And then we all went walking down towards the city, and the buildings were sailing past. And we were on some heavy, heavy acid that night, and there was literally a purple haze. So, of course, Jonas was just like, yeah, man. And off we were all going, Jimi Hendrix, Purple Haze. Jonas is taking us on this whole sort of, it was wonderful, right? Sorry to promote drugs, but it was amazing. And then another time I was talking, and Jonas and I connected right away because we were both extroverts. We were both, it's funny, say extrovert, but at least socially. And yet we were both had these narcissistic tinges to us as well. And Jonas looks at me and he goes, hey, man, you've got a gold aura. And I said, sorry. And he goes, you've got a gold aura. And I was, of course, like in between religions and thinking I'm going to hell. And I said to him, I go, yeah, man, that's the Holy Spirit, because I've got Jesus inside me. And Jonas just came alive. And whereas all my other friends, if I'd start to talk about religion, would be like, well, let's move on. Jonas stopped, and off we went, and we connected. And so I shared the gospel with him that night. And so I've got to say that I believe, and hearing that he was connected to church earlier, I did actually have a big hand in feeding his later religious connection, but he also fed mine, right? And then later, I had a really bad trip. Some may call it a psychotic break on acid one night, where I was having demons and all kinds of stuff. And Jonas was in the room, and I pulled him aside because I knew he'd responded well. And I told him all about, I'm seeing the devil, I'm seeing demons, this is happening, this is that. And he believed me. And he actually calmed me down. And I felt safe with Jonas. And so for me, then that was where Jonas and I maybe trauma bonded. I don't know, but we definitely connected. And, middle child of 3 boys, connection to America, yada, yada. Now, we never became best friends or anything like that, but we were definitely connected. And that was where I really started to love Jonas, you know? So yeah, so that's what happened there.
I don't know if I'm adding, but just a thought that came to mind, because I've been listening a bit to your podcast and the guests that you've had on, and this sort of getting my head around this experience that I haven't had about being a teenage what are you calling it? Deconstructing or decommissioning, or I'm not sure the word you use.
All of the above.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because the journey that your guests describe and that you've been through, mentioning those cults, is clearly very different to this thing that I've spoken about with Jonas, how he didn't come from that background. And it's sort of like he really actually benefited when he jumped into the religion. So that gift, you gave him a gift there. My experience with him as a kid, he had a lot of issues that came along. The rock stars like really sort of idolizing him, as I did as a kid, but there were some negative things that came along with that, and the drug use and all that sort of stuff. When I reconnected with him back in the 20s, and so that's some years after this period that you're talking about, and he was really ensconced in the church. And you and I have spoken a bit about this, Troy. That really straightened him up. He actually got a lot of benefit from that. So I think it's worthwhile, talking about that at some point, like that he actually, there's a reason why people become teenage fundamentalists, and those
Yeah.
reasons really helped him. They really helped him, and he sort of came in and out of his connection with God, with the church, with the Bible. All, let's say, them all being different things. He sort of had different intersections, as you call them, with those things, but they at a time where people were trying to, where I said there's a certain stage of life where people are trying to, they identify that it might be time to leave that situation. That was at a time of his where it really helped him to get into it.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to hear how close you were and
Well,
connected, but different.
and look, I hear you, and it's true, because later, coming out of the whole drug thing, the church gave me boundaries as well. So let me talk to you then about, because I've mentioned that I had this, couple of bad trips, and definitely they were psychotic because I was seeing the devil and all kinds of stuff. But Jonas started having these too, right? Aside from me. And there was this story that I'd heard, and I've heard Jonas tell it many times, but apparently I was there that night, but missed it. And we were at a nightclub in Melbourne called Commerce Club, which was this alternative, off the books kind of place that you'd all go to at like 2 and 3 in the morning, and we'd all drop acid. And, I'm sure there weren't licenses and other things that were supposed to be there for booze, etc. But who was drinking anyway, right? But we went in and they played a dance version of Sympathy for the Devil, right? So the Rolling Stones' Sympathy for the Devil, excuse me, and on it comes, and Jonas is sitting there, and it starts speaking to him. And he is convinced that the devil is introducing himself to Jonas. And here we are in this court of Satan, and the devil is saying, this is what I'm going to do for you. And Jonas believed that the devil was basically offering him fame and fortune, very Faustian kind of fame and fortune and superstardom and all this kind of stuff, but you've got to sell me your soul. And which is, it's totally psychotic and tripping out, bad trip, etc. But it's also very narcissistic and delusions of grandeur, right? And that was the thing about all these bad trips. They were never, you're just gonna, something bad's going to happen. It was always you were offered something amazing. And I was having the same stuff, right? It was psychotic. So anyway, what happens though is Michelle takes him home because he's freaking out. And he's really freaking out, and he's totally lost touch with reality. And the newspaper boy comes delivering the Age newspaper, throws it on the front doorstep. Michelle tells the story that Jonas is convinced that this is the delivery of the contract by Satan through the Age newspaper delivery boy to Jonas. Jonas is just wigging out, right? Now, I don't know whether it was in the same amount of days or weeks, but Jonas believes that he also saw Jesus in the mirror. He looks in the mirror, and behind him, he sees Jesus standing. And he opened up the Bible, and there's a verse in the Bible, the way that he told the story later on, it was he opened right to it. Probably it didn't happen that way. It was more that he opened it, flicked pages. But there's a verse in the Bible that says, Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me? But Jonas sees, Jonas, lovest thou me? And that was his conversion. Those events led up to all this, and that was basically where his conversion was. Mine was not a whole, my rejoining of the AOG was not a whole lot different, because I was seeing the devil and demons and all that. And in that, Jonas and I, mate, we're peas in a pod. One night I went to a club, and there were these people standing around, and I was having a great time. It was a positive trip, but I was still very religious. And these girls are walking out, and I said, "Hey girls, do you know that Jesus loves you?" And the girl turns to me and looks and goes, "Are you Jonas?" And I went, "No, Jonas is a man of God, but I'm not Jonas." And in that moment, I was like, oh, I'm not a man of God. Oh my God. And then all of a sudden I was off tripping, and I'm going to hell again. And it just turned really dark. But this is how I know I can see the concern in both your eyes, but this is how it weaved together. Jonas's friends, his non-religious friends, were very worried about him joining the religion, because I'd taken him to Richmond AOG, as we call it, Great Big AOG. And they were worried that this was going to sidetrack him from his obvious music career, because Jonas was very gifted, as you said. It got heated with me and them. a few times. I can't remember the other guy's name, but Michelle was another one. We hadn't recruited her yet, which we did later. But it was sex and drugs and rock and roll versus church. And so I'm on my way out of the rave scene, trying really hard to get out. So's Jonas, and they're really worried about where I am taking him and what I'm sidetracking him from. So this is about 1990, 1991 that we're at Richmond AOG. This isn't going to mean much to you, Ryan, but for those that are listening, David Evans, who was a Christian pop star in Australia at the time, we were dancing for him, doing all our rave. We came in and we were just super trippers. And here we were at church. And so for them going, we're reaching the world. Look, we've got these kids. We became this whole gang of us. It wasn't just Jonas. There was a number of us, right? There was about 5 or 6 of us that were just basically held up as, look at our church. We're bringing in these, dregs of the world and druggies, etc. But they didn't know how to handle us. And so they got us up dancing behind.
No one did.
Yeah, right. Yeah, this is true. This is true. So they got us up dancing behind David Evans, and we're giving our testimonies and we're warning all the kids about the evils of drugs, etc. And then we would go out and be tempted and take drugs and then just scare the shit out of ourselves and then turn up the next day. And so Jonas and I would respond to the altar calls. And an altar call is where at the end of the service, they'd say, come down and give your life to Jesus. We would go again and again and again because we just weren't sure that we were actually saved. And then I eventually stopped, but Jonas kept going. And it got to the point where every single meeting, Jonas would be up walking down the front because he just wasn't sure. He just wasn't, because he was out the night before doing whatever he was doing. And so what happened, Ryan, was we got up in, and I learned this term. It's called Fabulism. And Fabulism in a literary context refers to a style of writing that integrates fantastical elements such as magic, myth, and surrealism into a contemporary realistic setting. So it's essentially the weaving of fantastical concepts into everyday life. And so what church did for us was they basically gave a what's the word I'm looking for? A credibility, an authentic, a big tick to what we're experiencing, which was just drug delusions. But they started feeding us stuff. So we had these Christian urban legends like the vanishing hitchhiker. People telling us the stories. Oh, my friend was out, and their car broke down and this hitchhiker appeared and helped them and then vanished. Or, people are seeing angels. They're walking down the streets and there's a rapist, but he doesn't rape this girl. Why? Because I saw these angels, he says, and all this kind of stuff. And all these stories were being fed to us while we're seeing, Jonas is seeing Jesus in the mirror. I'm seeing demons on my friend's shoulders. Then we get introduced to New Age conspiracy, Brian, the tail end of the satanic panic, or actually the height of the satanic panic, which is, that there's demons everywhere and that there's, instead of saying, hey, these experiences may not be real, it might actually be that you were on acid. No one was suggesting we were drug fucked. No one was suggesting that we needed some sort of clinical therapy. They believed us because it suited their narrative. And more than that, they fed the delusions and started giving us books like Hidden Dangers of the Rainbow, telling us there was a New Age conspiracy, or Dark Secrets of the New Age. Tony Van Brown, sorry to mention Tony, Anthony, you are now a listener to our pod. He had an audio tape series about the New Age, which told us that Star Wars and the Muppets and everything was just part of a New Age conspiracy. Joanna Michelson's book, The Beautiful Side of Evil, Mike Wonke's The Satan Seller, Charles and Francis Hunter, Angels on Assignment. We were reading all these books. We were being given them and they were feeding the delusion. And so Jonas and I and others just got caught up in this fabulism where we believed that this was happening, probably more than most Christians, because we believed that we had seen it. And we both had exorcisms aside from each other. I had sleep paralysis on 2 or 3 occasions, which is totally natural and totally explainable. But back in those days, this was just the devil attacking me. And so there we were at Richmond AOG with our stories. And I know I just totally dumped all that on you guys, but this is where we were at. And this was the experiences that we were having.
It's funny because I'm not sure where this lines up chronologically with the period that you're describing, but when Jonas was amongst us, family, through this period, that I think it's the same time, we would always sort of test him in terms of, like, so why are you religious again? And so why are you associated with the church? And it was never any of those stories or techniques that it sounds like were deployed to get him inspired or connected. It was always about the stories in the Bible for when he was trying to convince us. It was never a hitchhiker story, and because I think he understood that without the sort of predisposal to the spirituality, those things sort of didn't really work on us. For us, he tried to use the logic in the actual parables of the gospel or the written word to try and use that as logical demonstrations of why he believed what he believed, and you could never shake him. So when you talk about he would be up the front all the time because it took him a while to come to his own, to build his own faith, I suppose I would call it. Outside of that, to us, that was never visible. It was always so strong, and it was always like he always came so ready to defend the Bible in particular and Christianity. And he had the intelligence, his own intelligence, like that book smartness from he brought with him, and all the Faustian arguments and all this sort of stuff. He brought all that with him, but he also had this book now that pre-armed him with the answer to every single question. So it's interesting to hear from you that he had to build this. While that's not what we witnessed at all. From the outside, from a sort of secular view, it was bulletproof. There was nothing that could get through that.
It's funny you say that, because now that I reflect, I never told my parents any of those stories either.
Yeah, right.
I think there's a part of me that knew this probably isn't real, or this probably didn't happen. But I know it definitely wasn't conscious, because I was convinced consciously that this was true. I want to share another story, and I'll slow down a bit, because I know that I was just sort of tapping into some serious trauma and what went through my sort of, which is why I say to my kids, don't ever do acid. But there was two guys who were from church who'd never done the sort of drugs that we had, and we had a prayer meeting. It was Jonas, myself, a guy named Alex, and a guy named Richard. And we were having this prayer meeting at my house in Ringwood one night. And Alex had his own trauma. He was an orphan, had grown up in systems, and he was a mess too. And Alex was very much a believer in this sort of Christian fabulism. And so we're having this prayer meeting one night, and then we're all listening for God. Is God speaking to us? What's God telling us, for the prayer meeting? And that may sound like it's psychotic, but actually very common in Christian sort of behavior, at least at that stage. And all of a sudden we go quiet, and Jonas is going, hey guys, I've got something. God's speaking to me. He says, beware the Rialto. And then we all stop and look at him and say, what? He goes, beware the Rialto. What does that mean, Jonas? Haven't you seen that building in town? It's huge, and it's dark, and it's really evil. And I reckon there's some really evil stuff going on in there. And God's saying to me, beware the Rialto. And then that became a line, because even I was starting to wake up to shit at that stage. And that became a line that we just said for years, that we'd say to each other, beware the Rialto, right? But Jonas carried it for a long time. I want to skip a little bit ahead, because he joined the Box Hill TAFE music program. And whilst we were all at Richmond AOG and all going, we're going to go to Bible college, we're going to save the world, Jonas all of a sudden exits stage left and goes off to do music at Box Hill TAFE. And yeah, you can use music for Jesus, but go and study it? What? And then he got hooked up with Clayton Christian Fellowship, which was this church, which was this small little church. And they were independent Pentecostal. And ironically, I was worried that it was a cult, right? So I go and check it out with Jonas, and they seem like nice people, etc. And, it was just, it was easy to get lost at Great Big AOG, but this was very small, and they took him in, and Jonas went and lived there. He lived with these people. He lived in the church manse, and he just sort of got taken over, right, by this scene, and he sort of vibed away to that. But then he had a couple of mini backslides, as we both did. Backslides meaning we sort of fell away from the church. And I remember seeing him one night on the rooftop of Inflation nightclub in King Street. And so we're full on for Jesus, but occasionally we'd sort of slip out and go clubbing. And there's Jonas. I walked up. I wasn't expecting to see him there. And there he is, sitting on a chair on the roof of Inflation nightclub. And we're talking away. And then he goes, and he was deadly serious. He goes, hey man, there it is. And I look up and there's the fucking Rialto building, right? And so Jonas is still really spun out by this. And I went and visited him, and he was writing his book, and he's talking all about his conversion and his Luciferic initiation, and he was really tormented. I could really see it, and I don't say that flippantly. And I didn't want to admit that this was possibly mental health issues because it's the 90s. Who admitted that? But also, it would mean that I would have to admit my own, especially at that stage in my life, right? This sort of drug-induced psychosis, and also admit that it was all a delusion. And so I didn't. I used to just look at it and go, okay, he's wrestling with demons. I'm wrestling with demons. Sleep paralysis. Jonas lovest thou me. It all adds up. Don't question it. Let's move on. But that was the basis for both of our Christian conversion, or for me, a reconversion, for him, a conversion. And I think that's really important because that fed, when we did deconstruct later on, which Jonas did, that really fed that. But another thing I want to share before I stop is that in about 1994, Jonas went to Kurt Cobain's vigil here in Melbourne after Kurt Cobain killed himself, and got up and said, I saw Jesus, and got booed off the stage. Right. So it's funny that, he's telling people at the Kurt Cobain vigil about seeing Jesus in the mirror. So he's not telling your family, but he's standing up in front of people his own age and saying, I saw Jesus in the mirror. So for him, that was real. That was totally real.
Yeah, I believe that it wasn't, like I described before about, music being this function to be a rock star. That particular story, he repeated a lot, and it did have its own function in his life, but he certainly believed it. He certainly believed it. Again, just hearing it, then being a sort of secular person, there's a couple of things. I mean, there's the sort of just faith generally, like, prove the existence of God to me, and then I'll believe it as well, that sort of thing. But then it's also, knowing Jonas and you guys, that's the more challenging part for me. The smart people, not blowing smoke, just, you're not a dummy, Troy. And, how do you have the faith without that evidence? It's not just that I don't see the evidence, but how to, that's part of the weirdness to all of this whole.
Yeah, well, as we go on with Jonas's story, there's the whole deconstruction where we started to challenge that experience. But I look back, and I've said this to Richard, the guy that I mentioned before about the Beware the Rialto session, and I said to him, thank you for all you did for me, right? Because Richard was evangelizing me while I was evangelizing Jonas. But I said to Richard, I wish you just told me it probably didn't happen. Maybe you need to see someone. Maybe you need to talk this through. Because I don't believe that my psychosis was ongoing. It was situational. Like I didn't have ongoing psychotic issues in my life or anything like that. It was just whenever I was on acid and not long after. So I think it would have been good for someone to really stop us. But again, that's why I made that point, that it suited their narrative of that there is a spiritual dimension, this is the church. And so I don't think they intentionally tried to hook us with this. They actually believed it themselves, but it fed this foundation for the faith to be built on. And I think that was convenient for them. And so in answer to your question, as far as we were concerned, we had really experienced it. We had seen it with our own eyes. We had heard it with our own ears. We had other people who had, shared delusions. So it all made sense. So why not continue on? I think if that hadn't happened to me, I don't think I would have ended up at Great Big AOG. I don't think I ever would have gone.
When you're at those inflection points in your life, I think, where you need something to be true, then the burden of truth and you testing that evidence is something you really don't press into, because you don't want to, I think, because deep down that it'll collapse if you do. So at that time, you believe it and you go, yeah, I tested it. And like Troy said, it really happened. It might have been an acid-induced haze, but it still happened. And also those people around you who are evangelizing you, they don't want to reveal that truth because that will then undermine all the work that they have done.
Also heard people and your guests of yours talk about, there are questions you just don't go ask. You just don't go there, that are not taboo. They're just like, you don't want to, you don't go there because they do shake the tree a bit too much to maybe some of these
Well,
truths.
it was a shared truism that drugs open the door to the spiritual realm. Right. And you
Sure.
would have all heard that. Right. And, and then they would say, oh, look at, peyote with the Indians. They were doing it, but they're speaking to demons and all this kind of talk. So there
Ayahuasca is
was,
huge at the moment.
yeah, right. So there was, within society, not within the church, there was this idea of it being a spiritual doorway, but they took it much more literally. And so, yeah, we had ways of experiencing it. But the thing that struck me is it's like, so why is it always demons? Why is it never angels? I mean, Jonas saw Jesus. Kudos to him. I never saw Jesus, right? But, why is it always fear, right? Why is it always the darkness? It was never,
Well, even with
like,
Jonas's story, the angel or the Jesus that he saw was there who turned up because the devil was there already. Like
exactly. Yeah.
yeah, and
Yeah.
yeah. Sorry to interrupt, but there's sort of a family dimension to this story. That's another part of it that I don't know if it's relevant, but I'm certainly going to go and share this with my dad after this conversation. Part of that story with him and the devil was that, and seeing Jesus in the mirror was after that happened, he went and burnt a lot of possessions,
Oh, yeah, we all did, man. We
right? And
burnt all our records.
that's right.
I burnt picture disc of Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, my prized possession. Oh, yeah, man.
And one of those possessions was this guitar that Dad had bought him. It was like a $1,500 guitar, and was sort of like back to that childhood story where Jonas had convinced Dad to buy him this expensive gift that no one else had ever been bought something that expensive. So that story to this very day is about not Jonas really believing that he saw Jesus. It's about materialism and him not respecting the fact that he was lucky to get the guitar when the rest of the kids didn't. That's sort of the family story that we tell himself. But really, for Jonas, that story wasn't about burning the guitar. Like, it got turned into some material thing for the family's narrative. But Jonas really believed that, and I think I need to take that back to the family. I think
Yeah,
that's an important part of that story for my
we
family.
we burnt all our drug paraphernalia. We burnt all our drug clothes because we were wearing, trippy hooded tops and all this kind of stuff. As a matter of fact, I've got photographs, and I'll cut them into the video, but I'll also share links so people can look at it. I've got photographs of me cutting Jonas's hair with a razor because he wanted to. He said, "Oh, this long hair," because we had long hair, was a symbol of pride and arrogance, etc. And he needed to cut it off. I wasn't ready to do mine then, but I shaved his head. And he wanted to look like, and it was really badly done. It wasn't like, your wonderful cut there. This was like bits and chunks and everything. And it was like, well, now you need to go to a hairdresser. No, I'm going to leave it like this because I want to be humble before the Lord. It was just freaky. We were.
Even just the idea of sort of, we were full on Christians, but then we would once in a while go and take acid at a nightclub. Just that scene is certainly, it's probably more unique than you think it is because you lived it. It's probably, because I'm familiar with that rave scene in Melbourne and I'm familiar with the Christian, but how many people were living that life? There's probably a small number on the planet, Troy. But whilst I can imagine what it was like, yeah,
as I say, it was just a little, not an accident that Jesus started turning up in our trips. But hey, I wanted to share these stories because I wanted it to feed Jonas's journey. So let's keep going, right? So do you want to talk to us just a little bit about your Elvis metaphor for Jonas? Because I think that's a really good point.
Sure. So, I mean, I was sort of talking off the cuff, so forgive me if I give it a new version, but really, we all know of Elvis in his different iterations, right? There's the Fat Elvis, GI Elvis, um, and Jonas had the same sort of chapters of his life, or he was able to partition his life off into different things so that, whilst there was sort of connections between different parts of his life, the rock star part of him took over. I think once he went to Box Hill TAFE and got much more accomplished, that he went into different phases. So there was sort of the early childhood phase, there was teenage phase, and then in the sort of 90s, he had a different outlook. Then in when was it? Just after 2000?
Well, it was like Dylan's Christian phase, right? It's like Bob Dylan's Christian phase. Jonas
That's
had
right.
his Christian phase.
That's right. Like, again, the family has this sort of narrative of like there was this Jonas, that Jonas, then there was the Christian Jonas, then there was and then he moved back to America, right? He moved back to America. Oh, this is something that is retrospective, and I think that he probably has carried the spirituality and the Christianity part of his life much more deeply held than just a phase. I do think it was, it peaked, and he was sort of certainly much more committed to the religious practices and the community of practice of being a Christian at certain phases. But this sort of love of the Bible and the Word of God, really, from those early years of being, 12 or 13 or 14, whenever he started really getting into the book, that never really left him. It was always anything. It could be like, getting a sandwich from the shop. That, there was always a metaphor in the Bible that he could relate to any experience, and a very meaningful way, not in a like trivial way for the sake of it. Like, actually, like, yeah, well, the reason we're even buying this sandwich is expressed, and he could recall that in a very specific way. So, but the way so that was innate in him. But externally, it was certainly, there's different chapters in his life.
So 1998-ish, I think that's when he started to going to Christian City Church in Camberwell, which was a bit of a scene, Brian. It was like a lot of the ex-Richmond people and a lot of the young adults, the 20-somethings were going there. I remember I bumped into him and he said, I said, what have you been doing all day? He said, I've been writing poetry. And it was just kind of like, what? Who does that? And Jonas did. Jonas was writing poetry, but he also liked to tell you, right, that he was writing poetry. But he had been to uni. He'd got himself a teaching degree. I don't know if he'd started teaching music in high schools by that stage, but that was another thing that he did. But by that stage, you could have bumped into Jonas and I at one of these sort of 20-something church events and never known that we had done what we had done, never known that we had come from where we'd come from. You would have just thought that we were just, sort of hipster Christian types. And Jonas became sort of, to me, someone that I used to know, but enough to say hi, but not enough to have deep and meaningful conversations. And so no one would have looked at us and known that we'd been at the gates of hell together, or that we were actually once really close friends. So that's where we sort of started to drift apart. But that's when, not long after that, I went to Asia and he went to America. So yeah, keep going, right?
Well, I'm actually interested in that part, Troy. So you connected very deeply and spiritually about very specifically Christian ideas, whatever, through tripping or hook or crook, whatever. But then when you get back in and you both commit to being part of it in a institutional community sense, whatever, and you go there, that's when you diverge.
Well, because we're in different communities. So I had been at, Great Big AOG. He'd been at Clayton Christian Fellowship. Then I went and joined South Melbourne Church of Christ. He went off and joined CCC Camberwell, which was very glitzy and glam. And I was going more sort of, leftist leaning, feed the poor kind of vibe. And so we're just in different scenes. I still really cared about him and I still loved to see him, but it just wasn't the same. But actually, I will stop, and because there's something that I skipped over. I did reach out to him at one stage because I got invited to speak at a Salvation Army youth group camp, and I wanted to do some music. And so I invited him along and said, hey, do you want to come along and, like we'll sing together, because I sang, and, you can do some of your stuff, we'll do some of our stuff, and then, I'm going to be the speaker. And that's when I first heard that Wings of a Dove song, which was one of his classics. And again, we'll link to that. But But you know what happened at that? And he did really well. He spoke well, sang well, played well. They loved us. It was really, really good. But I was dancing one night. And I wasn't married yet. I was dating this girl. I was very serious about her. And I ended up marrying her later on. But we're dancing at this youth group thing, which you'd never do as a Pentecostal, that kind of dancing, but it was a Salvos thing. And so we went with it. And this young girl her name is now Trudy Sayers, and she's like a pastor at some evangelical church. She's a somebody. Back then she was Trudy Tonkin, I think was her surname. And I was dancing with her, and she was being quite flirtatious with me. I was being flirtatious with her. It was all very fun and innocent and everything. Later we go back to our cabin, Jonas and I, and he fucking went at me. Like, because he was trying to flirt with her, and all of a sudden I was, and he just went whoosh, and oh man, I can't remember what he said, but he just had a go at me like, how dare you? And it was sort of like cutting his lunch kind of thing. And I just turned to him and went, whoa, dude, I'm with Heidi. I was just dancing, kind of thing. And here we were, Christian speakers on this camp, and Jonas had just lashed out at me like this, and I didn't know how to take it. And about an hour later, he came to me and apologized, and I sort of put it aside. But I remember you saying that he did have this side to him, that if you crossed him or if he felt he could, I don't know. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, well, it's part of the toolkit that you build when you are exposed to these sort of traumas as a kid in the context of our family. That when you have to deal with things like jealousy or something like that, you're not always prepared or equipped to just deal with it in a way when you can just pull out something like aggression or violence or aggression to deal with it. Sometimes that's what people do, and he did that often. And again, for someone who was very intellectual and very willing to go into these deep and feeling-based conversations, sometimes he would just ditch all of that and just resort to these things. And I think that I think that was linked to some mental health issues as well. But he could be quite cruel to people. And I mean, there's things like just we would all be working, doing quite serious manual labor on the family farm, and he'd be able to just sort of sit there and just watch us work. And like he had this sort of capacity without contributing. So he had a sort of capacity to sort of not connect and not be part of the group. And then I think that same sense would sort of extend to like it's all part of the same pool of narcissism and being able to do whatever you can to get your own way. And that's I suppose why I mentioned earlier about some of the positive benefits. I think he did that least when he was most connected to his church community, when he felt the most confident that he had a predictable family of church community around him. He did that stuff a lot less. And in fact, I used to like say to his face, you've changed, mate. You used to be such an asshole. And I could deal with it, right? Like it's actually helped me in my professional life to deal with assholes from my dealing with my brothers, especially him, right? And when I was, in those sort of 90s period, when he's getting up talking about Kurt Cobain in front of those people, I'd be like, mate, where's this gentle Jonas come from? I've never seen gentle Jonas. That's, so that's another Elvis, right? Gentle Jonas. And that was only prevalent. I think that's when that family, I think he said in Clayton, took him in when he lived in part of that Clayton church. And it was sort of like he had a quasi normal family, It's sort of like, well, and that gave him the confidence to not need to pull out that sort of cruel weapon as a way to get his own way. He could just take a breath and be like, well, I've got a family, a mother and a father at home who love me. Who are these? Who are the church? Or, like I know that tomorrow I can just turn up and be Rockstar Church Jonas playing the Christian song, and I'm going to have the adulation I need. I don't need to feel like just the fact that Troy's looking at some girl that I want to kiss is some slight on my character. He had a bit more, gave him the wherewithal, which is, it's a pretty strong thing for him then to leave that and deconstruct or whatever. Like, I get why it's, I don't know if it was even hard for him to leave, to be honest. I don't know that because I wasn't there. He did that when he was in America. But it would have been very hard because I witnessed how much solace that gave, how much confidence it gave him that he didn't have to use those underhanded tricks that you got to witness firsthand. But I saw them too, yeah.
I love Jonas, so I just want to make sure that I'm saying that was the only time I ever saw that. And it was also, he came back and apologized. But I guess I want to ask you, just in terms of what you saw the church and how the church was good for him at that stage. Do you want to speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So, it was sort of a closed shop in that I was very interested in the setup, the fact that the household setup, like who was who in the zoo and how did you feed yourselves, and like, I was sort of just finding my own feet as an adult. They're moving out of home, and I was just learning from all my family how to adult. And at the same time, he'd found this sort of family, Christian family, so I sort of was interested. But it was never very. It wasn't something that he would share about that stuff. It was sort of like not out of bounds, because he's not that sort of guy. It's like it was taboo. It's just like he wasn't interested in sharing that stuff. So it's hard for me to tap into sort of, the operation of what was going on there. But I can only see this sort of the effect of it, if that makes sense.
I always thought that it gave him guardrails, like because he'd had this sort of wild, and hearing about, he's only a, year 9, he's taking off to away from the family and living in Melbourne. It just sounds to me like the church gave him these guardrails that kept him on track, because as we know later on when he deconstructed, things didn't necessarily go well. But I'll put a pin in that one. But do you feel that's what it did? It just gave him boundaries,
Yeah.
or was it more than that?
It's funny again that the family narrative was around. He was fine until he got involved in the church, right? And I think that feeds into sort of the legacy story of the family more than anything else. I have always disagreed with that. I thought that the main thing is, like, he could deploy this cruelty that we spoke about, and I probably was, in the firing line of that more than most people often. And so to see that just shared without any pretense, and like he welcomed he acknowledged that was a thing that he had gotten rid of because of his circumstance being connected with the church, was really, it made me interested in the church to see that transformative value. It really, like, even before that, when I was sort of like 15, and like I would get the Bible based on the stuff that he'd show me, and then talk to my friends about it, just pass on what he told me and share them up. And they thought I was, they thought I was insane, right? Just by even mentioning it. But like, he really equipped me with everything I needed to say to them if anyone was interested. And I was interested, and that was why I was interested. It wasn't so much the guardrails, it was just, and that did bring that for him, and I think that was very healthy for him. But he was actually able to find much more empathy and much more consideration of others, and much more that narcissism. He never shed that, but he was able to sort of wrangle that so it was just another part of his personality, not the dominant thing. He was able to see himself as one part of a bigger system, and yeah, he wanted to always climb the ladder and be visible and a leader and all that sort of rock starry stuff. But he was also able to shut up once in a while. He could never keep he always had to be, like, talking and influencing and getting the biggest piece of cake. He always had to be doing that until this period where he moved into that close, those that I now think are sort of those Clayton years, where it's sort of like, I can actually be silent and sit in the corner and just observe. And that was the first time he'd ever really had that reserve. And it was really powerful.
Humility was a value that was pushed his way, right or wrong, good or bad. So yeah, I can understand that. Brian, I'm looking at you, knowing that you're a co-host to this podcast, and I'm feeling like I need to invite you with your perspectives or questions or something. before we get into America Jonas, because America Jonas is where it gets interesting too.
No, I'm just enjoying the story, to be honest. So I've been quite happy playing the role where I've only interjected a couple of times today because, as I said before, this is someone who I've known a lot about, but have no recollection of whether I actually met them. But their legacy certainly lived on in the times where I was involved in Richmond AOG as well, and later on, and all the reference points that you've used throughout your storytelling, Troy, but also your life in general about the importance of Jonas and in your life. So I've just been enjoying it. So apologies to everyone that I might be sitting here and not co-hosting well, but it's been great.
So, sorry to interrupt. Just for my own, to resolve some things in my own mind about this sort of
Please.
journey before getting to America. I'm just thinking about um, uh, how we came across in that environment. He was such an unusual character, and he was sort of the person that had this charisma, but he clearly wasn't in most settings. And I don't know about the Christian setting. In most settings, he stood out as someone who was sort of a loudmouth, who was funny, but also like a bit edgy and dangerous. And like he had this sort of energy about him. And we could never figure out how the church would put up with such a disruptive character. He was very disruptive. He was very like, get in there and pull it all apart. And how did that play in that environment?
Well, he was a Pentecostal, and Pentecostalism that is lauded, that is celebrated, right? And especially people with a past and people with a story. You know, like I would often get called a trophy of God's grace, and that's what Jonas was as well, because he had the stories. But we were, you know, by the time he was at CCC in Camberwell, which later became Stairway, which is another really culty group, by the way, and happy to put that out there. But there was this sort of young hipster vibe going on at that church. So where everyone was dressing well, there was a lot of big personalities. There was a lot of emphasis on music and being famous for Jesus. They wouldn't have put it that way, but that's what was going on. And so that's why he was attracted to that, but also why he was welcomed. So he was competing with a lot of big personalities in that church. And so I think what he'd learned at Clayton is when to pull back and just be there. But you always knew when Jonas was in the room. Everyone knew that. And yeah, that speaks to, you know, what happened later on. But I think he definitely fit in, because maybe you've got this mentality of the church being, you know, meek and mild Jesus. No, this is Hillsong, proto Hillsong Jesus that he was really connected to.
How do those churches relate to that Hillsong and mega churches? Are they literally connected, or is it just a in principle
Common
type
ancestors,
of
and a lot of cross. Like back in those days, Hillsongs didn't yet exist. Hillsong was part of the Assemblies of God. The CCC group was very much, you know, adjacent, and we would, you know, like a lot of AOG people were at CCC, and CCC people would move over to AOG. It was the community, the Melbourne Pentecostal scene. So yeah, it was celebrated. And he was celebrated because he was a story, he was a personality, and he was a gifted musician. That was key.
As someone who, like I said, is sort of committed to sort of art for its art's sake type of person, well, that's the story I tell myself anyway. When I see these like young Christian bands, even though like right now in this high def, like they're still doing in these studios, that music is so cringy and so bad. I could never see.
Yeah, I think
To me,
Jonas.
yeah.
Yeah, Jonas never made it as a Christian musician, because I don't
No.
think he wanted to be a Christian musician. And the other thing that I saw when I took him to that Salvos camp as my offsider, he wouldn't, you know, afterwards I was thinking this would be good. We could do this, you know, we could be a duo, and we could do this music, and we could move around. He didn't want a bar of it, because he wanted to be, you know, he wanted to be the Jonas James band. And yeah, you can come along and be my offsider, but I'm not going to be your offsider. And I wasn't even offering him that. I was actually saying we'll be each other's offsider, you know, go that way. But no, he didn't want to know. And I think he wanted a secular music career. He didn't want a Christian music career. So he'd get in there and play at church and do things and everything, but he was trying to go bigger than that. And it was also, I think, that art for art's sake, you could live that at CCC. You certainly couldn't have lived that at Great Big AOG where we were. but you could live that at CCC. So, you can be an artist for Jesus.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. All right. Well, hey, let's get into America Jesus. So as I said, 1999, people that have followed my story, I fell out of church, completely walked away, went to Asia. Jonas and I stayed in touch by email, but very loosely. But I felt he didn't know how to take my deconstruction because I was deconstructing and he wasn't. But then let's talk about America.
Sure. So again, I'm not sure of the exact years, like late, it was 2000 or a bit after, maybe he moved to America. And I'm not sure the impetus. And in fact, at the time, and I didn't share this with him, but we were closer than ever. So I was like, not hurt, like I didn't take it like as an action against me, but I was like sad, grieving because I was losing my brother to America. Because I never really understood what he was leaving or what was over there, and I still to this day I'm not really sure. But I do know that he went and studied theology at a Christian university in Virginia
Yeah,
Beach.
He did a master's in theology, I think. Yeah, it
Did a
was quite.
master's in theology.
Yeah.
That's right. And so he'd done a double degree at Melbourne Uni, teaching in music, and then he went over there and did a master's. And I think he was there for about 6 years studying at Virginia Beach. I'm not sure of the institution, but and he was very much involved in a Christian lifestyle, and he was engaged to be married. And I didn't. Again, it was the same with me. I was in touch with him via email a fair bit, but we didn't, and we spoke on the phone, but it was not, we didn't get the opportunity to have those conversations you have when you're having a coffee on Chapel Street for 3 hours, from 9 p.m. to 12 p.m., 12 a.m. one night and a Wednesday, like it's a different situation when someone's overseas. But I know that he also struggled with that sort of, you talk about I'm a Christian, but then I go to the nightclub. He was still sort of backsliding here and there, and the sort of sex before marriage was a big issue for him. I think that's why he got engaged to be married, so he could sort of, maybe. I was going to say, I'm trying not to be crass with a metaphor here, just to get closer to more sexual activity. I don't know. That's
No,
not
go
a
for it, dude.
metaphor.
It's
That's
all right.
literal.
We've walked away. You say it how it was.
He
Um,
wanted to have a root. Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, but it's not just that. It's not just that. Like I think he was really. I was going to use the word edging, but I didn't want to be too clever with the metaphor, right? But he was sort of edging towards like still maintaining what was within the set of rules, but but still like get some. And which is probably a story that's familiar to many of your listeners, right? It's like, where can I, first base is fine, but we can't have sex, so there's some spot in there, like, and for someone who's like, this person who, with all this charisma that we're talking about, to still be grappling with that as a 30-year-old man, like, I just could never, I couldn't abide it. I'm like, dude, just get your shit together. Like, do it, don't do it, who cares? Just like, why are you still, as a 30-year-old man, letting this institution
Ryan,
dictate your life?
there's a lot of church kids and church young adults that spend a lot of time between second and third base because that's where we seem to think you can get away with it. So
But it was more
really, really common.
complicated than that, though. It was sort of like, that's sort of just the easy story to tell about this thing where he was actually like living two lives, I think, during that study period, where he was a hardcore Christian doing his master's at a Christian university, but also like, treating, his partner not very well, not just in the sort of, trying to have sex, but like, like speaking cruelly. Some of that activity that we said he had shared at Clayton now sort of was coming back into his life a bit, because I think it was more like, maybe it was a shake up, not so much his commitment to the word of God, but to the church or to Christianity, or what, like, forgive me for not really having the language to, I know that you guys are good with this
No,
stuff,
it's good,
but
man. It's good.
there was that, and my conversations, and I know I've subsequently spoken to people that were speaking to him at the same time, and they sort of saw the same thing. In fact, some of his Christian friends really, fell out with him during this time because they were like, well, dude, you're more committed than ever because you're studying it. You've moved all the way over here. You're attending a Christian university, yet you're displaying some of the least Christian behaviours I've seen from you in decades.
He got himself an internship at some church. So he was actually on staff, paid a pittance, but he was on staff. So he was from a young adult Christian perspective, he was definitely on the path to success. Right. And so, that's what he was doing. And of course, I was right off the rails of Christianity and didn't want to know. So I didn't know about any of this until a little bit later on. But yeah, interesting.
And then when he finished studying, I mean, it got to the point though where my family flew over for the wedding, and then during that period, like whilst they were over there for the wedding, their relationship dissolved. And so that's how tumultuous it all was. Like it had gotten back to sort of like that sort of 15, the acid taking, levels of like unpredictability. It's like, what's going on here? Like the families come over for the wedding, and then
Can you remember what year that would have been?
2006, 5 or 6. I actually don't know. That's a complete guess, but that's a guess. But
because he called me, I was in China, and he'd heard through the grapevine of what, how I'd gone and everything. And he called me and he told me all about what, his masters of theology, his internship at the church. And he was really communicating to me that he wasn't happy with this kind of level of mediocrity that he was basically setting himself up for. And he asked me about antidepressants, because I had taken antidepressants for anxiety. And I said, yeah, man, changed my life. Absolutely brilliant. And it was as if he needed permission. He was seeking permission to take antidepressants because it still wasn't the sort of thing you did from our sort of church experience. And I guess in America, it might've been more open. I don't know. But I told him that this is what I'd done. And I think at that point, he's probably looking back to me going, oh, that's right. You were fucked in the head as well. I wonder how you've got on. And then he's reached out to me. And so I felt at that stage, we had a really long conversation, and I talked to him about my deconstruction, didn't call it that then, my deconversion. I told him that I didn't believe anymore. This is about 2009, 2010, somewhere around there. And I sort of, now I look back because I know what happens next in the story, and I kind of regret that. Not that it was ever my place to tell him what he could and couldn't do, but it was almost like he went, okay, I don't have to do this anymore. And then, what happened next?
sure. So the well, there's a few people in my life who are very intelligent, narcissistic. I mean, maybe not narcissistic, but have a very healthy opinion of themselves. There's sort of a spectrum there from narcissism to that, who refuse to accept mediocrity. And a lot of them really struggle to just do, like, I'm sort of like a boring dad who just goes to work and I'm happy with that. I love just spending time with my kids and things like that. And it sounds obvious, but a lot of people, especially with those characteristics of high intelligence and high narcissism, aren't willing to accept that. And he was one of those people. And I don't think he ever really was able to just have a 9-to-5 existence. And that always plagued him. And the church also, was able to help feed him whilst not having to sustain himself in that way. So there's also that sort of feature of the church as well. And I think that what you and I both witnessed was just that manifesting itself. But at the same time, he did have more severe mental health issues. So just talking about America, that phase, America Elvis, let's just start with that. He did have some severe mental health issues. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And I've asked people who have been, have worked with him on some of these issues, and their belief, and I know this is contested science, some of this stuff is, their belief is that his issues, whilst not helped by things like frequent acid usage as a teenager, that probably would have manifested themselves anyhow. And so that played a key role in all of this that we're talking about. So it's interesting to hear that he had that conversation with you about antidepressants, that he was obviously acknowledging that he had these things happening, but that would have been before his diagnosis. So, schizophrenia is quite, severe affliction. So that played probably more role than we ever, gave credit to, especially during this period.
You don't think it was the drugs that caused that? It maybe more sort of brought that out, but surely that wouldn't have helped.
That's right. Well, I do think, but from the advice that I've got, because I went away and spoke to a few people about it. The advice that I've received is that, you know what, even without that, it probably would have happened anyway. But it doesn't matter. I'm not sure that really matters to some extent. So, but all this is going on with him, and he doesn't want to be. He's sort of, the mental health is coming up, and I think that probably encourages these sort of feelings of uncomfort or discomfort with mediocrity, because you've got these sort of mental health issues, and plus you've already got this sort of nagging sense that you want to do more with your life. So he left that scene and he moved from the East Coast to the West Coast of America, up to Portland, where he was born. He moved back to where he was born, sort of full circle. And he'd been there, like through his life. He'd visited, especially my dad had taken him over plenty of times, and he'd met all the family. But my aunties and uncles there sort of not necessarily took him under the wing, but like hung out with him and helped him get some work and took him around to gigs and got him part of the Portland lifestyle. But it was a secular situation. It wasn't a churchy situation, though he did go and tend that, there's sort of a general level of religiosity in America that we sort of don't have in Australia, that he was able to tap into. Some of my family members are part of that. And he went and played music at their churches and was welcomed with open arms, but didn't really become part of the community of churches over there. And in fact, started to really embrace more of the rock star lifestyle, started taking more drugs, getting back into especially prescription drugs. He had, like in America, he used to joke. He showed me a picture of a bucket in the corner of his room. He's got, like, I just went to 10 doctors this month, and they all just gave me handfuls of drugs. And I didn't doctor shop. I just told them exactly the actual thing that was going on in my life about sleep and some anxiety, and they would just hand me all these drugs. And I had a bit of pain, and they just hand me all these drugs. And he had literally a bucket of drugs, all prescription, all legal, all cheap, that he would just take recreationally. And that obviously wasn't good for someone in his situation. And he was sort of, he was rudderless at that point. He lost that sense of community, and he was sort of alone. Just like you've described, he was always sort of alone, in like he wanted to be the Jonas show, but in the alone sense that he didn't have connections that were those guide rails or supporter base. So in that situation, he was sort of back to that sort of couch hopping 15-year-old moving from Broadford Jonas, just didn't know what to do. So my dad went over and said, "Hey mate, how about I pay for you to come back to Australia, and we'll get you back on we'll see if you can start your life again over here." And he was reluctant, but he's like, "Yeah, okay, let's give that a go." Because he still loved the American lifestyle, where you could go and you can go and speak to people on the street, and like you talk about meeting someone in a park near Greville Street playing guitar. Well, that is America, right? So, like America's, like, if you're into that lifestyle, go to America. It's awesome. I love America because you can 3:00 in the morning, you think you're going to get stabbed, and you end up hanging out with them for 3 days if you're lucky or unlucky. It's that sort of place. I love the energy over there.
At least on the coasts. At least on the coasts.
That's right. That's right. I love the energy over there. And he was really energized by it, whether it was healthy for him or not. Anyway, Dad bought him a plane ticket. He had a stopover in LA, where my cousin lived, and they were sort of the similar age, and she's very plugged into like the Hollywood sort of scene. And and I've got some of the details not exactly right here, because it's 20 years ago. Instead of getting on the next flight to come home, he just stayed in LA. He goes, "Oh, this is awesome. I love LA." So we stayed in LA, and that was sort of a big descent and downfall for him. So that sort of late 2000s. By the time I visited him in 2009, he was living on the streets. He was a full-blown meth head. I think that's the technical term, right?
I reckon that would have been a bit later, wouldn't it?
Maybe a bit later.
Yeah,
I
because
sort of
he
relate
spoke to me, he
everything
was still in church around then, so I reckon it would have been around
Right.
2012-ish. But anyway, yeah, it doesn't matter.
Well, Yeah, it was 2009, August 2009 is when I quit smoking, and that's after I saw him after this event. So it was
Okay, cool.
2009. Yeah.
All right, sure.
And he was still he was living on the streets, but he looked like a hipster, very well dressed, long hair, good looking. But when you spoke to him, it was sort of like, you could tell, like, like he was sort of very unsafe mentally. And poor guy, we sort of had this family reunion. We dragged him to this very expensive restaurant. Denzel Washington was there, and there was all these famous Hollywood people in this restaurant. And we've sort of dragged him off the streets literally for this family reunion. He's there sort of freaking out, hasn't had a proper meal for 6 months. This is the stage that he was at. And we were like, come on, mate, like cheer up a bit. He was with the family. We haven't seen you for years. And it was sort of like, we didn't know how to deal with it. And he didn't know how to deal with it. And we had arguments. And again, he was straight back into, he goes, oh, you don't know what I've seen. I could bash you right now. And went straight to that sort of mode again. It was like, oh man, you've just all that hard work and you've gone back to this sort of, way, sort of the base model. He's gone back to the base model, and it was all in the back of drugs. And LA is a sort of, very eat or be eaten, or whatever the phrase is, life, and he couldn't keep up. He could not, for someone who was so adept at going in and dominating a room and all this sort of stuff in that cutthroat world of Los Angeles. It was, once you're outside of the sort of there's sort of these two worlds over there. There's the really high end side, then there's the sort of low end, and he was sort of in the middle. He could dominate the middle class, but the street level stuff was way too violent for anything he could handle, and which is a feature. It's not a criticism. But then that glitzy stuff, I think when you bring all that sort of, like working class family trauma that we have, he found that sort of hard to cope with as well. So he was
it's hard for anyone to break into that, even
I know,
even
that's
people
right.
from wherever. Yeah.
But how you described how, the Pentecostal scene where it was sort of competitive to have the loudest voice, and I can see him thriving in that environment. In America, he loved that same competitiveness, because he wanted to win. But he didn't do it. And so you give up the mediocrity to chase that, but then you fail at that. Plus you've got schizophrenia and you're taking drugs. There's sort of, and you've sort of renounced the thing that gave you the guardrails. That all combined to really, really have an impact on his life, to say the least. And he was in a very bad state. I revisited in 2013 on my honeymoon. And I said to my wife, we did sort of a world tour, big save up honeymoon trip as you do. I said, look, last time I saw him, he was a bit, wild. How about I go see him and I'll send you a text if it's all good. I never sent her that text. By the time I saw him in 2013, he'd lost all his teeth. He was very gaunt. He was living in a studio apartment so he was off the streets, but it was sort of a state-funded thing. And I'll tell the story. So when I first saw him, I got him, he was stick thin. I gave him, we went for a meal. The first thing he did was kick me, just like a genuinely mentally ill, homeless person without teeth, just violently lashing out, to the point where we were in a restaurant and people came over. I'm like, it's fine. So, and I was quite emotional about that because I hadn't seen him, and I'm worried. I love my brother. Then he's like, oh, you got any money? And he's just desperate for money and blah, blah, blah. And I gave him $20 to buy a pack of cigarettes. He did. I told him to keep the change. We went to his house. As we were walking down the street, he was in a state where people are crossing the streets. Like this is how it was manifesting. And when we got to his place, he knocked on his neighbor's door and bought like a point of drugs for like $12. And the guy's like, oh, you still owe me from last time? He goes, yeah, I'm good for it. Oh, this is my brother. And the guy's like, oh, hey, mate. Oh, hey. And he proceeded to go to his place, and he shot up in front of me. And it was sort of like he was showing off as well. Like it was the bravado, like, little brother, I'm still like the hell man who can do whatever. I'm still like, can show up how tough I am and I can take on the world. I'm like, oh, you look pretty vulnerable to me, brother. But he's still like the fact that he's shooting up while I'm sitting just one-on-one at a table after not seeing him for 4 years. He's bleeding. He's licking the blood, like he's in a bad state, right? This is a serious scene. And then he sort of, the drugs kick in, and it's not a scene that I'm accustomed to. I'm trying to play it cool, whatever. And then after some manic moments, I wait for him to calm down, and the next 3 hours I spend with him. And we talk about you, Troy, because you and I have had contact in previous years, and we talk about Paul and other mutual friends and the family and family history. And it was a really like important moment in my life that we shared. And the drugs almost like, he was like up and down, really manic and really serious and wild. But I was able to sort of extract a lot of information, a lot of feelings. So I mean, it was really, for me personally, it was a really wild thing. But a lot of it was about the Bible and was about religion and was about, he really, I'd never seen him try so hard to try and to connect with me and use these stories that he'd embedded. He didn't have to, the book was nowhere to be seen. I mean, that's not true. It was there literally, but he didn't need to refer to it as a text. It was all just streaming out of him as a stream of consciousness. And it was just amazing to witness. It was like the full, like, experience of Jonas, of all this. It was sort of like, I mean, this is probably, bad taste, but it's sort of like, at the end of Terminator, where it's like he's melting and all these voices are coming out. That's what it was like. And but I knew all those voices. It wasn't the murmurings of a crazy drug-addled homeless person. Everything he said made sense to me, and it was still that person that, if you listened, he actually did. It actually was making perfect sense, and I ignored the scene to try and get to that, and I really.
But he was fragmented, right?
He was fragmented.
He was
and
fragmented,
he was lost.
but it was all parts of him.
It was all parts of him. And I knew that I could hear those parts of him and all those different Elvises. I could hear, oh, that's G.I. Elvis and that's this Elvis. And they were all like, melting and coming out. But I knew from that time that any other human being witnessing that would not be able to see what I saw. They could not. They would just see these ramblings of a madman. And it descended into these characters that in the literature that he was so connected to in the Bible, but elsewhere, that he'd become one of these characters and he was lost in it. And I sort of had decided in my own way then that I was sort of, I didn't give up on him. And he's like, I still tried to say, you could come back and live with us. And we were still in contact. And I got on the phone to my wife and they met that way and stuff like that. And I didn't let him go, but I let him go in terms of, because I know that with those sorts of drugs, it changes it's not like heroin and things like that. It changes the chemical makeup of your brain, and the elasticity of it, and you don't recover. And that I was convinced that happened. Now, if I can just, I'm just sort of conscious of time and stuff. So I said, you know what? I didn't have as much contact. So then what's that? That's in 2013. It's now 2025. So that's 12 years ago. And I never saw him again. So on the 28th of January this year, he passed away. And I mean, you can probably pick up from the stories I've been telling that there's a lot of stuff going on, but just in my relationship with him. And so whilst I'd sort of cut off and like my hope for him, really, I thought that he'd gone beyond what a comeback. I still was very, it hurt and it was very shocking at the time. And I've been dealing with that. What is it now? It's now May. So I've subsequently gone and we've gone and got his belongings and his ashes, and we've had a service for him. And I've had a good opportunity to reconnect with you, Troy, and some of his friends and family and things like that. But interestingly, I sort of, even though I gave up on hope, it turns out that he didn't really give up on himself. And
yeah, tell me about the last period, whatever you want to call it, L.A. Elvis or, Jonas, whatever you want to call it. What was that last period? Because you said he had a really serious health scare, and he cleaned up a bit.
That's right. So 2013 happens, and then that's in my life, that's a milestone. And then in 2015, unbeknownst to any of us back here, he had a heart condition diagnosed. I think he sort of collapsed. He was, very frail and very unhealthy just from drug use, but he had a health issue, which was, a combination of like hypertension and plaque buildup. And it's sort of lifestyle issues, but it sounds like that it was not necessarily preventable without, some sort of monk existence, which he certainly wasn't living. And that happened in 2015. And the doctor that he presented to in, the emergency situation in America told him that if he doesn't get off the drugs, he'll be dead in months. And he responded to that. And so the same way that he practiced guitar for 5 hours, or that he was able to, commit to particular reinventions of himself by dedication and discipline and sort of intellect, he did the same thing with his own lifestyle, and he got off the prescription drugs, and he got off the street drugs, and then prescription drugs, and then cigarettes, and then unhealthy food. And one by one, he got off these things of his own accord. And I spoke to a caseworker who was very close to him. She's an Australian woman that lived near there, and they're still, until he died, and this is a year or so after she stopped being his caseworker, to maintain a good relationship. She was like, look, let me help you get into rehab and give you the medicine to help get off the drugs and all these things. And he said no to all of it. And one by one, he sort of cold turkeyed himself off these things. And in a weird way, he sort of, all of this sort of wanting to be a rock star and rejecting mediocrity and all of the things that we've spoken about and many more, according to her and the description, very detailed, she was very much part of his life, it all dropped. And it was very pleasing to me to really discover that he reached this same sort of middle-age, boring bliss that I've attained, that is sort of like, I was listening to like a political podcast this week, and there was sort of like, all of these countries that are trying to attain wealth, they reach it, and then they just become these sort of boring places. And that's actually like the utopia that we want, where you don't have to worry. You don't, you go to bed at a reasonable hour, and you wake up fresh and early, and you eat good food and all this sort of stuff. And that's sort of the ideal that we want to achieve. And the funny thing is, when you're there taking acid, going to these nightclubs, that's not what you're trying to get to. Spirituality through drugs and trying to reach these heightened things. But then when we reach middle age, we review that, and we're all boringly predictable. I've got my demographer hat on again. And I lost hope that he would ever have that. Actually, I never had hope that he had ever reached. I'm not talking about had hope that he reached that as a life stage, but that psychologically that he was ever capable of doing that. But he got there, and it was through.
So Ryan, what did his life look like then in the lead up to his passing?
So he stopped hanging out late at night on the mean streets of LA. He was home in bed, tucked in by 9 o'clock. I mean, all those things that we see on the news, about the street encampments and stuff. That's his neighborhood, right? Like, it's serious stuff. It's really, serious over there in America, obviously. And he would get up in the morning and he had his favorite sandwich shop and go and get a coffee. And he became a sort of, as she describes it, a community elder. He would go and, even after he quit cigarettes, he would source cigarettes for people who he knew to need them. And he did it intentionally, only in ways that he wouldn't get credit for it. And which is really bizarre. I mean, even just people hearing our conversation, Troy, you and I described the sort of person that he was. For him to go there and not, how can that not be tied to the stories that he's read in the Bible? To me, that's him again trying to sort of emulate these things. But that's just I'm just projecting that there. But he was very in touch with his faith, and he was very grateful that he'd had that health experience. So you and I, Troy, knew this story about him in the mirror with Jesus, and that was a story that he believed and that he also repeated as a tale that had lessons in it. Well, that story got replaced by his heart issue. And it's sort of like, I was in trouble and I'd been through all the ups and downs. And then, he really saw that God, it gave him that heart health issue. according to her. That was the story, right? And so that he was still Pentecostalizing through that experience, through the street people of Santa Monica at that time, but it was in a much more sort of he wasn't the central character. It was really in service of not even the faith or Christianity, but just trying to help the people, just trying to give them some solace.
That's my next question. How would you describe his label, his religion? Did he still have a religion? I mean, it sounds like he did, but you know what I'm asking, right? Was he still a Christian? What kind of a Christian was he? Was he at all?
Yeah, I mean, I know I don't have. I love listening to your podcast because of all the sort of you have language that really helps someone like me who's willing to go there understand the real nuances, right? But I don't have that language, so bear with me, right? So man of faith, I think he was a man of faith. Let's call it that, right? So, and I don't necessarily think it was faith in a prescribed religion. I think he had his own version of that, and it was rooted in the Christian Bible. It came from that. The reason why I think it was rooted there was because I don't think he could accept that book with full of those stories could just come from just a bunch of dudes sitting around thinking about it, right? That's a very simplified version, but I just don't think. Well, no, he would like when I would test him on these things. That's often where all roads would lead to these things. It's like, well, you explain to me, Ryan, how someone could have written this book. So, because it was like the book it was such a weird, yeah. But in the later years, the way that Louise, his carer, described it to me was he was a man of service. And it wasn't about the faith being shared. It was about he saw his own expression of faith in the service of others. It wasn't necessarily about convincing others. So I don't know how that answers the question, but that is a very different version than the one that we witnessed him going through. Very different.
You know how it strikes me, Ryan, is that it's a complicated end to a complicated story. So it's good enough. It is what it was, right? And yeah, I'm looking for a label, but forget that. It's a complicated end to a complicated story. So how did he pass? What took him in the end?
Yeah, so it was a heart. I've got his death certificate. It was a heart failure. Whatever that means. The way it's described, it could be, it could be described as eating too many hamburgers in some circumstances, right? But then when I delved, because he was poor, you don't get the privilege of a real analysis of that. But he also had, so let's just cover this off. He had severe schizophrenia. He had this heart condition, but he also had type 1 diabetes. So we don't really know, but what it seems like is that he's had an episode with his heart that may or may not have been brought on in conjunction with his type 1 diabetes. He was alone at home in this isolated situation. Yes, he was out in the community, but he really lived alone. And he didn't have anyone to help him, and he went into sort of a coma or a heart, where his heart stopped, and he hadn't cashed one of his welfare checks. And so they checked on him a few times, and then 3 or 4 days after not responding, someone went in and found him alone, and his body there, living alone in the same place that I visited him in 2013. So he'd had this place for 12 years, so he wasn't living on the streets, but it wasn't the same room that I witnessed, which was just strewn with stuff everywhere. His clothes were hung up. Everything was neat and tidy. And he seemed to have some order. He had, he'd been with this, you don't get much money on welfare in America, but he'd been able to save some. But it was sort of, in one sense, it's quite sad to think of my brother just dying alone. Though, he extracted himself, as the family, you sort of put yourself in the center of this story, but it was he extracted himself and chose to do that. But regardless of that, it's still very sad to think of anyone, dying alone. Even if sort of my telling of that story to some of his friends who I know still are very much Christian and live in that community. I know it's brought some solace to them knowing that he's still connected to his faith. Yes, okay, but that didn't stop him dying alone in a situation where it's a lifestyle based health issue that maybe in different circumstances, that could have been prevented. I just, so
Sure.
yeah.
Well, Ryan, looking at time, this may be our longest episode ever, which is cool. But I just want to say that I loved your brother. I loved your brother a lot, and the reason why I wanted to do this episode, and thank you, Brian, for agreeing to do it, is because he was amazing. He was a rock star. He was never famous, but he was a rock star, and the impact that he had on people, like you said, he would have made a great cult leader, as would have I. People say, and I'll share some photos. People say we looked alike when we were young, but I always felt safe with Jonas. And maybe that's because of that episode in, Brunswick Street, Fitzroy, having that trauma bonding around my psychotic episode. Or maybe it's because he was awesome. But hearing that he was in service to people at the end of his life and doing what he was doing, I knew that side of Jonas even back then, where he could care and he could show warmth and compassion. But I just think it's a great story, and I wanted to pay homage to my friend, but also the fact that it intersects with the stories we're telling with the podcast. I thought it really would suit, So thanks for being a part of this, and thanks for telling a warts and all story as well.
Yeah, you're welcome. Hopefully that contributes somewhat to the conversation. I mean, it's my story, it's his story, but it's your story. It's like it's. I do think that his journey, let's call it, has a lot of lessons in it, just as do all the people I hear on your podcast. So I'm keen to thanks for welcoming me into this space. I'm going to be continuing to listen to the episodes and seeing who else you get on, and seeing by hearing their stories I learn more about my brother as well, so that's interesting. I appreciate that. Thanks.
Yeah, and look, I hope this is something you can share back with your family too.
I will.
Yeah, it sounds like, there's a lot of things that you've learned about him from Troy as well. So, but I guess from my perspective, I just want to say thank you. It's an incredibly powerful story, but I also felt while you two were having a conversation, it was a bit of a sacred story as well. And there were so many times where I didn't want to actually intrude on that, because I think that there was such powerful stuff coming out of it. And I think our listeners will get a lot from it. I did. I sat there and, as I said, I'd had all these vague intersections of Jonas in my life. But for me, it really felt like I was learning so much about someone, but so much about life through Jonas as well. And we all know a type of Jonas, and I think people have come across them, but this brings together so many different personas. As you say, you describe it as the Elvises, but there's so many different personas, I think, from many different people that are embodied in Jonas. And I love the story.
Yeah, and I've got to say, that we didn't script this, but in the end, the melting down of the Terminator and all the different Elvises, all the different Jonases coming out, and you could actually see, his life flashing before your eyes, kind of thing, was really powerful. So yeah, so thanks, Ryan.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for. I mean, it's good.
Man says peace with his mouth, but war is in his heart. I see violence and strife in the city, threats and lies on every street. I said all that I have, the wings of a dove, I would fly away. Yeah. watch over me, yeah. And darkness is all that I see. There are times when I'm looking for strength. Hell, it slaps my peace in the face. Yeah. I said all that I had, the wings of a dove, I would fly away. Yes, I would now. I said all that I had, the wings of a dove, I would fly away. Me and rest, and me and rest. But there's no Messiah, is it any wonder that we want to fly? Take that step to the sky. Just like children with tears in their eyes. It's to heaven I'm praising my cry. I will trust till I die. Walk the streets, the urban sprawl, see the broken monuments of the fall. I curse his head and take to flight, a toxic angel and the poison night. I said all that I had, the wings of a dove, I would fly away. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I said all that I had, the wings of a dove, I would fly away. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be here again after so long.
If you'd like to connect with the I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist podcast, then please see the links in our link tree in the show notes. We invite you to join our listener community on Facebook, and we're also on Instagram, X, and Reddit. Check out our merch on Redbubble. We've got t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, and all kinds of great evangelical stuff that you can wear proudly. All proceeds go to building and promoting the podcast. We want to give a huge shout out to our Patreon supporters. Subscribers get a range of benefits, including free merch, early access to episodes, access to our exclusive subscribers group, and monthly bonus content. Again, all proceeds of this go to the running and promotion costs of the podcast. A special thanks to Ava, who manages our social strategy, and also to Kerry and Bree, who manage our Facebook listener group, and also to Bree, who puts out our monthly newsletter on Substack. All of our episodes are transcribed by Leanne to increase accessibility. The show is produced and hosted by Brian McDowell and Troy Waller. The sound engineering for this episode was done by Clifford. I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist is available wherever you find your podcasts. Again, you can find all our links in our link tree in the show notes. Or why don't you pop across to our website at www.iwasateenagefundamentalist.com